You think you can ignore me? Answer me! Look at me! You are worthless.
Pick that up, you useless piece of defective garbage. Look at this file. 4 different families tossed you right back to the state like a broken toy, and I'm starting to see exactly why. You aren't a child, Leo. You're a feral animal that should have been left on the streets to rot. The heavy, metal-pronged manila folder exploded violently against 12-year-old Leo's chest. The sharp edges of the thick, compacted government documents sliced a thin, clean line across his collarbone before cascading in a chaotic, disorderly wave across the grease-stained linoleum floor of the Miller family kitchen. The room reeked heavily of stale tobacco smoke, cheap lard, and the suffocating, unmistakable aroma of systematic domestic cruelty. Gary Miller stood towering over the boy, his massive, heavily overweight frame practically vibrating with an aggressive, alcohol-fueled rage. He wore a stained, ribbed white tank top that stretched precariously over his protruding belly, a thick, cheap gold-plated chain sinking deep into the rolls of his fleshy neck. In his massive, meaty hand, he gripped a half-empty bottle of generic domestic beer, using it like a baton to point aggressively at the scattered papers on the floor. On the laminate counter behind him sat the shiny, electronic keys to a brand-new, metallic blue Ford F-150 truck parked prominently in the driveway outside, a $70,000 luxury vehicle funded entirely by skimming state check allocations. Leo didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He didn't even blink as the heavy paper folder struck his small frame. At 12 years old, his body was severely underdeveloped, his physical growth permanently stunted by years of severe nutritional neglect. He stood perfectly motionless in the dim, unlit corner of the kitchen, draped in a tattered, ridiculously oversized flannel shirt that had been discarded by Gary's biological son 2 winters ago. His pale, hollow face was a mask of absolute, unreadable stillness, but his eyes, deep, void-like pools of intense, charcoal black, burned with a silent, untamed, wolf-like defiance that held an unsettling maturity. He had small, pale scars zigzagging across his knuckles, ancient souvenirs from a childhood spent surviving the concrete gauntlets of the American foster care system. This was the 5th residential placement Leo had been violently shuffled into in less than 3 years. The State Department of Child Services had long since given up on him, sloppily stamping the words combative, unmanageable, and severe behavioral disruption onto the front of his permanent administrative record. In the cold, fiercely bureaucratic landscape of the United States social welfare system, a child who refuses to bow down to abuse is quickly labeled as broken. The system didn't want to heal his profound trauma. It wanted to process him like industrial waste, passing his file from one overwhelmed caseworker's desk to another until he turned 18 and could be legally dumped into the prison system or the streets. And that was exactly why the Millers had taken him in. Gary and his equally cold, calculating wife, Brenda, didn't operate a home. They operated a low-overhead, highly profitable foster farm. They didn't see a deeply traumatized child standing in their kitchen. They saw a guaranteed, tax-free monthly direct deposit of $1,500 from the federal government's specialized high-needs foster stipend fund. To the Millers, Leo was nothing more than an agricultural livestock unit with a high profit margin. They received the government checks meant to provide him with premium health care, organic nutrition, and therapeutic clothing, but instead, they funneled every single cent into their own shallow desires. While Gary's 2 biological children sat in the brightly lit, heavily heated living room next door, eating thick-cut prime ribeye steaks and playing games on a massive, 70-inch flat-screen television, Leo was completely isolated. He was forced to sleep on a thin, mildew-covered mattress directly on the freezing concrete floor of the unheated basement, surrounded by rusted tools and scurrying rats. His daily sustenance consisted of expired, dented cans of generic green beans and stale white bread, rationed out to him like prison gruel. He was the invisible ghost of the household, completely stripped of his humanity, working 12 hours a day doing backbreaking manual labor, scrubbing toilets, mowing lawns, and washing the family's fleet of vehicles, while the Millers bragged to their neighbors about their charitable hearts for taking in a troubled foster youth. "Do you hear me talking to you, boy?" Gary roared, slamming his beer bottle down onto the laminate countertop with a deafening crash that made the cheap plastic plates rattle in the sink. "The state of this registry says you're an unadoptable psycho, a permanent drain on public resources. The only reason you aren't rotting in a juvenile detention center right now is because my wife had the pity to sign your placement forms. The government doesn't pay us nearly enough to deal with your creepy, silent attitude. You aren't a human being in this house, Leo. You are a paycheck, a monthly direct deposit. The moment that check stops clearing, I will throw you out on the highway myself." The verbal venom rumbled through the kitchen, but it completely failed to penetrate Leo's psychological armor. He had learned long ago, at the tender age of 6, when his biological mother abandoned him at a freezing, dilapidated gas station in the middle of a torrential downpour, that tears were entirely useless. Tears were a luxury for the weak, a vulnerability that predators like Gary used as a signal to strike harder. Every insult, every scream, and every heavy-handed blow he had received across 5 different foster homes hadn't broken his spirit. It had acted like an industrial forge, crystallizing his soul into a cold, unbreakable sheet of carbon steel. He stood there, absorbing Gary's toxic rage, storing it deep within the dark, silent recesses of his mind, maintaining a terrifyingly calm composure that completely unnerved the older man. "Get down on your knees and clean up my kitchen floor." Gary snarled, his face twisting into an ugly, crimson mask of frustration because he couldn't force the boy to cry or beg for mercy. "Pick up every single piece of that trash file, and then you're going down to the basement to chop the firewood for tomorrow. Move." Leo slowly, deliberately sank to his knees. His movements were mechanical, fluid, and completely devoid of any subservient panic. His small, calloused fingers reached down, gathering the scattered white pages from the greasy linoleum. As he stacked the sheets, his eyes caught the bold, aggressive red stamp splashed across his psychiatric evaluation history. Placement failure, high risk of permanent institutionalization. The system had completely written him off before his life had even truly begun. They had diagnosed his silence as madness and his survival instinct as rebellion. Gary walked over, his heavy, mud-caked work boot aggressively stepping directly onto the last remaining paper, pinning it to the floor right next to Leo's hand. Gary leaned down, his foul, alcohol-soaked breath hitting the boy's face like a physical wave. "Tomorrow morning, we are going to the wholesale commercial market to load up the back of my truck. There's a severe winter storm coming in from the north. If you drop a single crate, or if you make one single mistake that alerts the state inspectors who visit next week, I will lock you in the crawlspace beneath the floorboards for a week without a flashlight. Do you understand me, you broken little trash?" Leo didn't answer with a word. He slowly lifted his head, his pitch-black, unyielding eyes locking directly onto Gary's face with a terrifying, absolute promise of survival. He pulled the paper out from under Gary's boot with a sharp, violent tug that ripped the edge. The stage was set. The freezing storm was descending upon the city, and Leo had absolutely no idea that in less than 12 hours, a chance encounter in a freezing supermarket parking lot would bring him face to face with a ruthless, grieving matriarch who was about to recognize the sleeping wolf inside him. Welcome back to our channel, friends. Before we dive into the next chapter of this story, please take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video so you never miss an episode. Let us know in the comments, have you ever encountered the hidden, tragic realities of the foster care system? We read every single comment. The concrete floor of the Millers' unfinished basement was a freezing, unforgiving slab of solid ice. There was no heating vent down here, no insulation, and absolutely no comfort. The only source of illumination was a single, bare, low-wattage incandescent bulb dangling precariously from a frayed wire on the ceiling, casting long, menacing shadows against the damp cinder-block walls. The air was thick with the suffocating smell of mildew, rusted iron, and forgotten things. Down in this subterranean prison, 12-year-old Leo was rhythmically swinging a heavy, rusted wood-splitting axe. The tool was meant for a full-grown man, the wooden handle splintered and entirely too thick for his small, malnourished hands. Yet he swung it with a terrifying, mechanical precision. With every heavy, echoing thwack, a thick log of solid oak split cleanly in two. His breath formed thick, white clouds in the freezing air, his chest heaving under the ridiculously oversized, tattered flannel shirt. His knuckles were raw, the skin peeling and bleeding from the aggressive friction of the rough wood, but he did not stop. He knew that stopping meant a brutal, alcohol-fueled beating from Gary. Above him, the ceiling floorboards vibrated violently with the heavy, thumping bass of a Hollywood blockbuster movie playing on a massive, 70-inch flat-screen television. He could hear the loud, obnoxious laughter of Gary's two biological sons, Tyler and Mason. They were 14 and 16, two deeply spoiled, arrogant teenagers who had thoroughly absorbed their parents' sociopathic cruelty. Earlier that evening, Tyler had casually kicked a half-empty can of soda down the basement stairs, laughing as the sticky liquid splashed across Leo's thin, mildew-covered mattress. Leo hadn't said a word. He had simply wiped the mattress down with a dirty rag and returned to chopping the wood. The stark, nauseating contrast between the two worlds existing under the exact same roof was a sickening testament to the absolute failure of the American child welfare system. Every single month, the state government deposited a tax-free stipend of $1,500 directly into Brenda Miller's checking account. That money was federally mandated to provide Leo with trauma counseling, premium nutrition, winter clothing, and a safe, nurturing environment. Instead, that government money was the lifeblood of the Millers' upper-middle-class illusion. Leo's trauma stipend paid for the monthly financing on Gary's $70,000 Ford F-150. It paid for the thick, juicy prime ribeye steaks that sizzled on the kitchen grill while Leo was fed expired, generic canned beans. It paid for the designer sneakers Tyler and Mason wore to high school, while Leo's feet were shoved into a pair of heavily worn, unlaced tennis shoes that were 3 sizes too big, salvaged from a free donation bin behind a local church. The Millers had absolutely perfected the grotesque art of the foster farm. Brenda was a master manipulator, a woman who knew exactly how to play the bureaucratic game. She knew precisely which days the overworked, underpaid state social workers were scheduled to perform their mandatory 15-minute monthly wellness checks. On those specific mornings, Brenda would temporarily move Leo out of the basement and into a staged, brightly lit guest room. She would buy a cheap, hot pizza, force Leo to wear a clean, long-sleeved shirt to hide the bruises on his arms, and smile warmly for the caseworker. The exhausted state employees, carrying a caseload of 80 children each, never bothered to look past the superficial illusion. They would check their boxes, sign their clipboards, and drive away, leaving Leo to be immediately thrown right back into the freezing basement the second their taillights disappeared down the street. But as Leo lifted the heavy axe and brought it crashing down onto another oak log, his dark, charcoal-black eyes revealed a startling, undeniable truth. He was not broken. The social workers thought his absolute silence was a symptom of severe psychological damage. The Millers thought his lack of tears meant he was a defective, emotionless sociopath. They were all completely wrong. Leo's silence was his armor. His refusal to cry was a deliberate, calculated act of supreme rebellion. He had realized at a very young age that giving his abusers the satisfaction of his pain was a form of surrender. By withholding his tears, by staring back at Gary's furious, screaming face with the cold, unblinking eyes of an apex predator, Leo retained total ownership of his own soul. They could starve his body, they could freeze his hands, and they could steal his government funding, but they could never, ever touch his mind. He was a lone wolf biding his time, enduring the unendurable, waiting for the day he would finally be strong enough to break the chains himself. At 4:30 a.m. the next morning, the heavy wooden door at the top of the basement stairs was violently kicked open. "Get up, you useless parasite." Gary's rough, hangover-laced voice boomed down the dark stairwell. "The storm is moving in fast. We're going to the commercial market. Get your boots on and get outside to warm up my truck. You have 60 seconds before I come down there with my belt." Leo was already awake. The freezing temperature of the basement had made sleep virtually impossible. He slowly stood up from the damp mattress, his joints aching and stiff from the back-breaking labor of the previous night. He reached for a thin, faded gray windbreaker hanging on a rusted nail, a pathetic, completely unlined piece of fabric that offered absolutely zero protection against the brutal, sub-zero winter temperatures currently ravaging the city. He slipped his bare, freezing feet into the oversized, worn-out sneakers, tied the frayed laces as tight as he possibly could to keep them from falling off, and silently marched up the wooden stairs. When he stepped out the front door, the sheer, violent force of the winter wind hit him like a physical punch to the chest. The sky was a dark, bruising, ominous purple. The temperature had plummeted to 14 degrees Fahrenheit, and heavy, razor-sharp flakes of snow were already beginning to blanket the driveway. Leo's teeth instantly began to chatter, a biological response he could not control, but he forced his jaw shut, biting down hard on the inside of his cheek until he tasted the metallic tang of his own blood. He climbed into the back of Gary's luxurious, heated Ford F-150. Gary did not allow him to sit in the front passenger seat. Leo was forced to sit in the cramped, freezing extended cab area, surrounded by empty beer cans, greasy fast food wrappers, and heavily soiled moving blankets. Gary climbed into the driver's seat, blasting the premium heating system entirely on his side of the cabin, leaving the back vents completely shut off. "If you drop a single box of supplies today, I will make you walk the 7 miles back to this house in the snow," Gary threatened, putting the massive truck into gear and aggressively pulling out of the driveway. Leo simply stared out the frosted window, his dark eyes watching the wealthy, manicured suburban neighborhoods blur past them in the early morning gloom. He wrapped his thin, shivering arms around his small chest, completely unaware that this brutal, freezing morning was about to drastically alter the trajectory of his entire existence. Because across the city, in the warm, immaculate interior of a $1 million luxury vehicle, an incredibly powerful woman was also heading toward the exact same supermarket, a woman whose past was just as violently scarred as his own. The biting, sub-zero wind howled through the sprawling, freshly salted parking lot of the Oak Ridge Commercial Market, an upscale grocery warehouse located in the wealthiest district of the city. The storm had fully descended, unleashing a furious, blinding barrage of heavy sleet and snow. The temperature had plummeted to a bone-chilling 9 degrees. Gary Miller sat comfortably in the driver's seat of his idling, $70,000 Ford F-150, the premium cabin heating system blasting at maximum capacity. He took a long, arrogant drag from a thick cigar, the pungent smoke filling the warm interior as he scrolled through sports scores on his expensive smartphone. Outside, in the freezing, unforgiving onslaught of the blizzard, 12-year-old Leo was fighting a desperate battle against the elements and human cruelty. He was wearing the same thin, completely unlined gray windbreaker. His bare, freezing hands were turning a dangerous, sickly shade of mottled blue and purple. His oversized, unlaced sneakers offered absolutely zero traction on the treacherous sheets of black ice coating the asphalt. Yet Gary had forcefully ordered the boy to carry 4 massive, heavily overpacked canvas grocery bags from the store's loading zone to the truck, entirely by himself. The bags were filled with premium cuts of expensive meat, heavy glass jars of imported sauces, and luxury goods that Leo would never be allowed to taste. The sheer, crushing weight of the groceries was nearly half of the malnourished boy's entire body weight. Leo took a staggering step forward, the biting wind whipping his dark hair across his freezing face. His muscles screamed in agonizing protest, his joints locking up from the extreme cold. Every single step on the slick ice was a monumental effort of sheer, unbreakable willpower. 30 yards away, a massive, midnight black Bentley Mulsanne pulled smoothly into the VIP parking zone directly in front of the market's glass doors. The uniformed chauffeur immediately stepped out, opening a large, heavy black umbrella to shield the rear passenger door from the violent snowstorm. He opened the heavy car door, and Evelyn Vance stepped out into the freezing air. Evelyn was 65 years old, a woman entirely forged from absolute, unyielding iron. As the widowed matriarch and sole acting CEO of Vance International, a multi-billion-dollar global real estate and private equity empire, she possessed an aura of terrifying, regal authority. She was draped in a flawless, custom-tailored black cashmere winter coat, a subtle but astronomically expensive diamond brooch pinned to her lapel. Her silver hair was styled with immaculate precision, completely undisturbed by the howling wind. Evelyn was a woman who routinely destroyed ruthless corporate raiders and arrogant politicians before her morning coffee. She observed the world with the cold, calculating eyes of an apex predator who had conquered every obstacle in her path. As Evelyn adjusted her leather gloves preparing to walk into the store, a sharp, sudden sound cut through the howling wind. Re-yip, crash. Evelyn turned her head. About 20 yards away, one of the heavy canvas bags Leo was carrying had suddenly given way. The thick fabric, weakened by the freezing sleet and severely overloaded, tore violently down the side. A cascade of heavy glass jars, thick metal cans of soup, and expensive produce plummeted onto the icy asphalt. 3 glass jars of premium marinara sauce shattered instantly, splashing dark red liquid across the pristine white snow like fresh blood. Leo froze, his blue, shivering hands still gripping the torn handles of the bag. Inside the heated truck cabin, Gary threw his phone onto the dashboard and violently shoved his door open. He marched out into the blizzard, his massive, overweight frame stomping across the ice, his face twisted into an ugly, crimson mask of absolute, unhinged fury. "You worthless, defective little piece of trash!" Gary roared, his voice echoing over the howling wind, completely ignoring the few wealthy shoppers rushing to their cars. "Those were $20 imported jars. I told you not to drop anything. You are completely useless." Evelyn stopped walking, her sharp, calculating eyes locked onto the scene. She watched as the massive, aggressive man towered over the freezing, malnourished child. Gary didn't stop at screaming. In a flash of alcohol-fueled, uncontrollable rage, he pulled his heavy, leather-gloved hand back and delivered a vicious, backhanded slap directly across Leo's face. The sickening smack echoed sharply. The sheer force of the blow snapped the 12-year-old boy's head to the side, sending him stumbling backward. He slipped on the black ice and fell hard onto his hands and knees, right into the freezing, shattered glass and red sauce. A few bystanders gasped, quickly looking away and hurrying to their vehicles, entirely unwilling to involve themselves in someone else's domestic violence. But Evelyn did not look away. Her entire body went completely rigid. Leo did not cry out. He did not whimper, and he did not curl into a defensive ball on the ice. Slowly, agonizingly, the boy pushed himself up from the freezing slush. A thin, bright crimson trickle of blood ran down from the corner of his split lip. He lifted his head and looked directly up at Gary. From 30 yards away, Evelyn felt as if the entire universe had suddenly stopped breathing. The air in her lungs vanished. Her heart, a muscle that had been hardened by decades of ruthless corporate warfare, violently slammed against her ribs. She saw the boy's eyes. They were pitch black, deep, and burning with a silent, untamed, magnificent fury. It was a look of absolute, unbreakable defiance. And as the boy gripped his bleeding lip, Evelyn saw the pale, jagged scars crisscrossing the child's raw, freezing knuckles, defensive wounds, the permanent physical markers of a child who had spent his entire life fighting just to survive. Evelyn Vance completely stopped breathing. The designer leather clutch in her hand slipped slightly from her grasp. She was no longer standing in a freezing supermarket parking lot. She was transported 40 years into the past, standing in a dim, run-down alleyway, looking into the exact same eyes. Arthur. Before her late husband, Arthur Vance, had become a brilliant, untouchable billionaire who built a global empire, he had been an abused, discarded orphan in the brutal foster care system of the 1960s. Arthur had those exact same pale, jagged scars on his knuckles. He had possessed that exact same feral, silent, unbreakable stare when the world tried to crush him into the dirt. Arthur had always told her that true power wasn't born in boardrooms. It was forged in the freezing dark, by the children society threw away, the ones who absolutely refused to break. And now, staring at the malnourished, freezing 12-year-old boy bleeding on the ice, Evelyn saw the undeniable, brilliant ghost of the only man she had ever loved. Gary grabbed the remaining grocery bags, aggressively shoved Leo toward the truck, and slammed the door shut, locking the boy back into the freezing extended cab. The Ford F-150 revved its engine and sped aggressively out of the parking lot, disappearing into the blinding white snowstorm. "Mrs. Vance?" the chauffeur asked nervously, stepping forward with the umbrella, noticing the sudden, terrifying stillness of his boss. "Are you all right, ma'am? Should I call the local police?" Evelyn slowly turned around. The sophisticated, polite mask of a high-society widow was completely gone. In its place was the terrifying, absolute wrath of a billionaire matriarch preparing to unleash total, unmitigated destruction. She knew exactly how the system worked. If she called the local police, Gary would lie, the corrupt social workers would cover for him, and the boy would face a horrific beating behind closed doors. She could not simply intervene. She had to completely, surgically dismantle Gary Miller's entire existence. "No," Evelyn whispered, her voice as cold and lethal as liquid nitrogen. She turned her back to the supermarket doors and stepped right back into the luxurious warmth of the Bentley. "Cancel my morning meetings," Evelyn ordered, her eyes burning with an icy, unstoppable vengeance as the heavy car door closed. "And get Elias Sterling, my chief legal counsel, and my private investigative team on a secure conference call immediately. I want every single piece of data, every bank record, every tax return, and every state foster care file connected to the license plate of that blue Ford truck. I want that man's entire life placed on my desk by midnight." The penthouse office of Vance International sat 68 stories above the freezing, snow-choked streets of the city, a sprawling fortress of black marble, dark mahogany, and floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass. The violent winter storm that was paralyzing the metropolis below battered against the massive windows, but inside the executive suite, the atmosphere was a terrifying, absolute vacuum of dead silence. Evelyn Vance stood rigidly by the glass, her hands clasped behind her back, staring down at the microscopic, glittering lights of the city. She had not taken off her black cashmere coat. She had not eaten. She had simply stood there for the past 6 hours, her mind operating with the cold, lethal precision of a military supercomputer. The image of the freezing, malnourished boy bleeding on the asphalt refused to leave her mind. Society looked at children like him and saw broken, defective liabilities. But Evelyn knew the profound, hidden truth of the world. She knew that when you place a piece of coal under the crushing, unimaginable pressure of total abandonment and systemic abuse, it doesn't break. It crystallizes. It turns into a diamond so hard and so sharp that it can cut through steel. She walked over to her massive mahogany desk and gently picked up a heavy, silver pocket watch. It was battered, heavily scratched, and completely devoid of any monetary value. It had belonged to her late husband, Arthur Vance. When Arthur was 12 years old, he had been beaten halfway to death by a drunken foster father. Arthur had survived, escaped into the freezing night with nothing but the clothes on his back, and spent the next 50 years building a multi-billion-dollar global empire. Arthur had always told her that true kings are not born in castles. They are born in the freezing dark, learning how to survive the wolves until they realize they are the deadliest wolf in the forest. Evelyn gripped the silver watch tightly. She was not going to let another wolf be crushed by parasites. At exactly midnight, the heavy, soundproof oak doors of the executive suite swung open. Elias Sterling, Evelyn's chief legal counsel and the most terrifying, high-powered corporate litigator in the state, stepped into the room. Elias did not look tired despite the late hour. He looked deeply, profoundly disgusted. In his left hand, he carried a thick, 3-inch black leather dossier, practically bursting with printed documents, bank statements, and state registry files. Elias walked silently across the expansive Persian rug and dropped the heavy dossier directly onto Evelyn's mahogany desk with a resounding, authoritative thud. "You were entirely correct to bypass the local police, Evelyn," Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned over the desk. "If you had dialed 911 in that parking lot, the corrupt bureaucratic machine would have immediately protected itself. The local precinct would have called the Department of Child Services, and the caseworker would have warned the family to clean up their act. The boy would have been swept right back under the rug." Evelyn sat down in her high-backed leather executive chair and opened the black folder. "Tell me everything, Elias. Spare absolutely no detail. I want to know exactly what kind of insect I am about to crush." "His name is Gary Miller. He is 48 years old, chronically unemployed, with a heavily documented history of domestic complaints that miraculously never result in an arrest," Elias began, tapping a manicured finger against a stack of highlighted bank statements. "His wife, Brenda Miller, is the primary license holder for the foster home. They are not a family, Evelyn. They are a highly efficient, government-funded parasitic enterprise. They are currently running a shadow foster farm." Evelyn's eyes narrowed into lethal slits as she rapidly scanned the documents. The sheer, staggering volume of financial fraud laid bare on the pages was sickening. "The boy you saw in the parking lot is named Leo. He is 12 years old," Elias continued, his tone dripping with acidic contempt for the Millers. "Over the past 10 years, Gary and Brenda Miller have cycled through 6 different high-needs foster children. They deliberately request children who have been labeled as severe behavioral risks or unadoptable by the state. Because the state pays a premium subsidy for high-risk cases," Evelyn deduced instantly, her financial brilliance easily connecting the horrific dots. "Exactly," Elias nodded. "They receive a tax-free federal stipend of $1,500 a month for Leo, specifically allocated for trauma counseling, premium nutritional plans, and specialized clothing. But my forensic accountants hacked into Gary's primary checking account this afternoon. Look at the ledger, Evelyn. It is an absolute abomination." Evelyn flipped to the financial breakdowns. The rage inside her chest began to boil, burning hotter than the sun. Gary Miller had systematically embezzled every single penny of a traumatized orphan's survival fund. Last month, Brenda had submitted a fraudulent state voucher for $400, claiming it was for Leo's equine therapy. The exact same day, Gary's bank account showed a $400 debit at a luxury auto shop for premium, all-terrain tires for his Ford F-150. Brenda had claimed an extra $300 for severe dietary restrictions, while grocery receipts from that exact week showed massive purchases of prime ribeye steaks, expensive imported beers, and video games for their 2 biological sons. "And the state oversight?" Evelyn asked, her voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly whisper. "How is a child visibly malnourished and covered in bruises, passing the mandatory monthly physical wellness checks?" Elias pulled out a photograph of a nervous-looking, middle-aged woman and slid it across the desk. "Her name is Diane Higgins. She is Leo's assigned state caseworker. She is grossly incompetent, massively overworked, and completely corrupt. She conducts her inspections from the Miller's living room couch." Brenda Miller gives her a cup of coffee and a cheap gift card, and Diane signs the legal wellness documents without ever actually looking at the boy's living conditions. She has been rubber stamping this horrific abuse for 3 years, just to keep her caseload numbers down. Evelyn stared at the photograph of the caseworker, and then at the extensive list of Gary's fraudulent financial transactions. These pathetic, greedy insects were feeding off the flesh of a broken child, using the United States government as their personal ATM. We have enough hard evidence right here in this folder to send Gary and Brenda to federal prison for a decade on wire fraud and tax evasion alone, Elias stated, closing the heavy folder. I have my team of litigators on standby. I can have a federal injunction drafted by sunrise. We can hand this entire dossier over to the FBI field office tomorrow morning. The feds will raid the house, arrest the Millers, and place the boy in emergency state custody. No, Evelyn commanded. Her single word echoed through the massive office like the strike of an executioner's bell. Elias paused, looking at his boss with a mixture of surprise and deep respect. No. If we give this to the FBI, Elias, the bureaucratic machine will drag this out for months, Evelyn said, her eyes burning with a cold, unstoppable hellfire. Gary Miller will hire a cheap defense attorney. He will claim he is a struggling foster parent. He might get a plea deal. And Leo will be thrown right back into the exact same broken system that labeled him defective in the first place. He will be shipped to a sterile group home, and they will medicate the wolf right out of him. I absolutely refuse to let that happen. Evelyn stood up, walking around her desk. The aura of absolute, terrifying sovereign power radiating from her was suffocating. When is the corrupt caseworker, Diane Higgins, scheduled to conduct her next monthly inspection at the Miller residence? Evelyn demanded. Elias checked his encrypted tablet. According to the state registry calendar we breached, Diane is scheduled to visit the Miller household tomorrow afternoon at 2:00 p.m. A slow, chilling, utterly terrifying smile crept across Evelyn Vance's face. It was the smile of a billionaire who had just decided to casually purchase someone's entire existence just to burn it to the ground. Perfect, Evelyn whispered, looking out the glass window into the violent, swirling blizzard. Gary Miller thinks he is an untouchable predator because he knows how to manipulate a broken system. Let's show him what happens when a real monster walks into his living room. Draft the papers, Elias. Buy the mortgage to their house. Freeze their bank accounts. Call the county sheriff, the one whose mayoral campaign I single-handedly funded last year. Tomorrow at 2:00 p.m., we are not going to call the authorities on the Millers. Evelyn turned back to Elias, her eyes black and absolute. We are going to obliterate them. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked with agonizing, rhythmic precision. It was 1:55 p.m. The Miller household was vibrating with a frantic, desperate energy. Brenda Miller was practically running in circles, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, aggressively spraying lemon-scented air freshener to mask the lingering smell of damp basement mold and old tobacco smoke. Gary was standing in the living room, barking orders at their 2 biological sons to shove their video games and empty snack bags into the hallway closet. Leo stood in the corner of the kitchen, his posture rigid and unresponsive. He had been ripped from the basement hours earlier, scrubbed down with hot, abrasive soap that left his skin raw, and forced into a pristine, long-sleeved white button-down shirt that was 2 sizes too tight. Brenda had slapped a thick layer of concealer over the fading bruises on his neck and jaw, an act of cosmetic deception that made Leo's skin crawl with disgust. "Listen to me, you little freak," Brenda hissed, leaning in so close that Leo could smell the sickly sweet mint she chewed to mask her own rot. "If you say one word about the basement, if you mention the cold or the food or the work, I swear on my life, I will make the basement look like a 5-star hotel compared to the crawl space I'll lock you in tonight. You're going to sit on that couch, you're going to smile, and you're going to tell Diane that you love it here. Do you understand?" Leo didn't blink. He stared directly through her, his charcoal-black eyes reflecting nothing but a deep, cold, and eternal void. He knew exactly how to survive the next hour. He had done it a dozen times before. He was an expert in the art of the perfect, soul-crushing lie. At exactly 2:00 p.m., the doorbell rang. Brenda's face instantly melted into a mask of maternal, soft-spoken warmth. Gary straightened his shirt and put on his devoted father face. They opened the door to reveal Diane Higgins, the state caseworker. She looked exactly as tired and overworked as her file suggested, shoulders slumped, clutching a worn leather clipboard, her eyes glassy with the apathy of someone who had long since stopped believing that any of these homes were actually safe. "Hi, Diane. Come on in, it's freezing out there," Brenda chirped, ushering the woman into the house. Diane sighed, stepping into the hallway and shaking snow off her umbrella. "Thanks, Brenda. Just a standard check-in. Need to verify the living situation, talk to Leo, and get a signature for the quarterly review. Should take 10 minutes. "Of course, honey," Brenda said, leading her into the living room. "Leo, honey, come here and say hello to Diane." Leo walked out of the kitchen with a measured, artificial gait. He sat on the edge of the velvet armchair, his hands folded neatly in his lap, the long sleeves of his shirt effectively concealing the jagged scars and fresh bruises on his arms. "Hi, Leo," Diane said, not even looking up from her clipboard. She was already pre-filling the checkboxes. "Everything going okay at school? The Millers treating you well?" "Yes, ma'am," Leo said, his voice flat, hollow, and completely devoid of inflection. It was the voice of a robot, a perfect, chilling performance that was exactly what the system demanded of him. Diane scribbled a checkmark on her sheet. "Great, keep up the good work." Brenda let out a barely audible sigh of relief. It was working. The same mindless, superficial ritual that had been playing out for 3 years was nearing its end. In 5 minutes, Diane would be back in her car, the stipend would be authorized for another month, and the Millers would be free to return Leo to the darkness of the basement. But then, the doorbell rang again. It was a sharp, loud, authoritative sound that echoed with an intensity that made the entire house fall dead silent. It didn't sound like a neighbor or a delivery driver. It sounded like an intrusion. Gary frowned, looking at the door. "Who the hell is that? I wasn't expecting anyone else." "I'll get it," Brenda said, walking toward the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She cracked the door open, ready to dismiss whoever it was, but the words died in her throat. Standing on the front porch, framed by the blinding white storm, were 3 figures. In the center stood a woman wrapped in a black cashmere coat that cost more than the entire Miller family's annual income. To her left was a man in a sharp, charcoal-gray suit who Brenda instantly recognized from the news, Elias Sterling, the most feared attorney in the city. To her right was the county sheriff, looking grim and entirely official. "Good afternoon," Evelyn Vance said, her voice smooth, calm, and utterly terrifying. She didn't wait for an invitation. She simply stepped across the threshold, her presence instantly sucking all the oxygen out of the hallway. Brenda stumbled backward, her mouth agape. Who are you? You can't just barge into my home. This is private property." Evelyn didn't even acknowledge Brenda's existence. She walked past her, her eyes scanning the room, landing directly on Diane Higgins, the caseworker, and then finally resting on Leo, who was sitting motionless on the armchair. "My name is Evelyn Vance," she said, finally turning her icy, regal gaze toward the paralyzed Gary Miller. "And I believe I've just purchased your mortgage." The silence in the room was absolute. Gary's face turned from a confused red to a sickly, pale white. "What? What are you talking about? That's impossible. We have a bank loan." "You had a bank loan, Mr. Miller," Elias Sterling said, stepping forward and opening his leather briefcase. He produced a stack of legal documents and laid them on the coffee table, right next to Diane Higgins's clipboard. "My firm bought the debt from the regional lending institution at 8:00 a.m. this morning. We are the lien holders now. And because you are currently in breach of the residential occupancy agreement, due to extensive, verified evidence of criminal financial fraud and child abuse. We are executing a mandatory, immediate foreclosure." Diane Higgins, the caseworker, stood up, her face turning crimson with panic. I don't understand." "Who are you? This is a state-managed foster home." Evelyn turned to the caseworker, her gaze cutting through the woman's pathetic attempt at authority. "And you, Diane Higgins, are officially under investigation by the state's Office of the Inspector General for systemic negligence, bribery, and the falsification of state records. I suggest you stop speaking immediately, unless you want to add obstructing a federal investigation to your list of impending criminal charges." The sheriff stepped forward, his hand resting on his badge. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, you are both under arrest for the systematic embezzlement of federal foster care stipends, tax evasion, and the felony child endangerment of the minor in this room." Brenda let out a shrill, hysterical shriek, collapsing onto the carpet. Gary stared at the papers on the table, his brain completely shutting down as the crushing weight of reality finally settled on him. He had spent years gaming the system, assuming he was the smartest person in the room, never once considering that he was nothing more than a parasite waiting for a giant to notice him. But Evelyn wasn't done. She walked across the room, ignoring the sobbing Brenda and the catatonic Gary. She stood directly in front of the armchair. She looked down at Leo. The 12-year-old boy looked up at the woman in the black cashmere coat. He saw the cold, ironclad power in her posture. He saw the sheriff behind her. He saw the terror on Gary's face. And for the first time in his life, the dark, void-like pools of his charcoal black eyes seemed to flicker. Evelyn Vance didn't offer a pitying smile. She didn't reach out to stroke his hair. She knelt down, bringing herself to eye level with the boy, and pulled the battered silver pocket watch from her coat pocket. She laid it gently in Leo's small, shaking hand. "You have been fighting wolves for a long time, haven't you, Leo?" Evelyn whispered, her voice low and intimate, cutting through the chaos of the room. Leo clutched the watch, his fingers trembling. He looked at the scars on his knuckles, then up at the woman who had just burned his prison to the ground. "I'm not a wolf," Leo said, his voice quiet, finally breaking his silence. "I'm just trying to stay alive." Evelyn stood up, her gaze shifting back to the sheriff. "Get them out of my sight. And take that woman," she pointed a gloved finger at Diane Higgins, "to the precinct for questioning. I want every single signature she ever filed on this house scrutinized." As the sheriff hauled Gary and Brenda out of the house in handcuffs, their screams of rage and denial echoing into the snowy street, Evelyn Vance didn't look at the chaos. She didn't care about the destruction she had just caused. She only cared about the small, scarred boy who was finally breathing free air. "Come on, Leo," she said, turning toward the door. "We're going home." Leo stood up. He left the oversized, tattered flannel shirt on the armchair. He left the mildew-covered mattress in the basement. He looked at the house one last time, turned his back on the nightmare he had survived, and walked toward the light, finally beginning to understand that the diamond inside him was no longer hidden in the dark. The aftermath of Evelyn Vance's absolute, surgical destruction of the Miller household was swift, brutal, and entirely devoid of mercy. The heavy, metallic clink of the handcuffs locking around Gary Miller's thick wrists echoed like the final, definitive slam of a prison door. The arrogant, abusive man who had spent 3 years terrorizing a helpless 12-year-old boy was completely paralyzed. His massive, overweight frame trembled violently as the county sheriff aggressively pushed him toward the front door. "You can't do this. You can't just come into my house." Brenda Miller screamed hysterically, thrashing against the grip of a second deputy. Her carefully constructed facade of the loving foster mother had entirely melted away, revealing the terrified, greedy parasite underneath. "We have rights. The agency approved us. That boy is a liar. He's a defective psycho." Elias Sterling, standing immaculately by the mahogany coffee table, simply picked up his leather briefcase and adjusted his silver tie. "Your rights, Mrs. Miller, ended the exact moment you decided to use a traumatized orphan's federal stipend to finance a luxury truck while forcing him to sleep on freezing concrete. The bank accounts have already been frozen by a federal injunction. The truck is being repossessed as we speak. You have absolutely nothing left. As Gary and Brenda were hauled out into the blinding, freezing snowstorm, their pathetic cries fading into the howling wind, the oppressive, suffocating darkness that had haunted the house for years instantly lifted. Diane Higgins, the corrupt caseworker, was slumped against the wall, her face buried in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as a detective began reading her Miranda rights. She knew her career, her pension, and her freedom were entirely obliterated. Evelyn's team of forensic accountants had already handed over a mountain of irrefutable evidence, proving Diane had accepted thousands of dollars in bribes to falsify state wellness reports for dozens of foster homes. Amidst the chaos, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminating the living room through the windows, Evelyn Vance stood perfectly still. She turned her gaze back to Leo. The 12-year-old boy was standing quietly near the entryway. He was still wearing the thin, oversized white button-down shirt Brenda had forced him into. He held the battered, silver pocket watch tightly in his small, scarred hands. His dark, charcoal-black eyes were wide, taking in the sheer magnitude of the destruction playing out before him. For his entire life, the system had told him that adults like Gary and Diane were untouchable gods who controlled his fate. He had believed that his only option was to endure the pain in absolute silence. But then this woman in the black cashmere coat had walked through the front door, and with a few soft, terrifying words she had shattered the gods into dust. Evelyn walked slowly toward the boy. She didn't crouch down this time. She stood tall, projecting an aura of immense, quiet strength, and looked down at him with a gaze that held profound respect, not pity. "The system failed you, Leo," Evelyn said, her voice steady and clear. "It labeled you as broken because it was easier for them to throw you away than to understand the strength it took for you to survive. They wanted you to cry. They wanted you to break so they could mold you into something weak, something easily controlled. But you didn't break." Evelyn reached out and gently laid her gloved hand on his small shoulder. It was the first time in his life that an adult's touch didn't bring pain or fear. "My late husband Arthur was just like you," Evelyn continued, her eyes reflecting a lifetime of memories. "He was beaten, starved, and told he was nothing. But he took every single scar, every insult, and every brutal night in the cold, and he forged them into an empire. The world is terrified of children like you, Leo, because they know that if you ever realize how powerful you truly are, you will be unstoppable." Leo looked up into Evelyn's eyes. The thick, heavy armor he had worn for years, the absolute, icy silence, the refusal to show emotion, began to fracture. A small, trembling breath escaped his lips. For the first time in his 12 years of existence, he felt something he had never allowed himself to feel: hope. Elias Sterling stepped out onto the porch, opening the heavy front door. "The car is ready, Mrs. Vance. The Child Protective Services emergency transfer order has been signed by the federal judge. You have temporary emergency custody, pending the formal adoption hearing next week." Evelyn nodded, turning back to Leo. "You are never going back to a basement, Leo. You are never going back to a state facility. You are coming with me. Are you ready?" Leo looked down at the silver pocket watch in his hand, feeling the cold metal warming against his palm. He looked at the house that had been his prison, and then he looked up at the woman who had just handed him the keys to the world. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply nodded, his dark eyes burning with a fierce, quiet determination. They walked out of the house together. The freezing wind whipped around them, but Leo barely felt the cold. The massive, midnight black Bentley Mulsanne was waiting in the driveway, its engine purring softly. The chauffeur opened the rear door, and Evelyn gestured for the boy to get in. As the heavy door closed, plunging the luxurious cabin into a warm, quiet stillness, Leo sank back into the plush leather seat. He watched through the tinted window as the Miller house faded into the snowstorm, a pathetic, broken shell of a nightmare that he had finally conquered. The wolf had survived the winter, and now it was time for him to claim his territory. The interior of the massive, midnight black Bentley Mulsanne was incredibly warm and completely silent, insulated entirely from the violent, sub-zero blizzard raging outside. The soft, ambient amber lights of the luxury cabin illuminated the space, creating a stark, breathtaking contrast to the freezing, damp darkness of the basement Leo had left behind forever. Leo sat perfectly still on the plush, hand-stitched leather seat. He was still holding the battered silver pocket watch tightly in his small, scarred hands. He looked out the tinted window, watching the blinding white snow blur past as the powerful vehicle navigated the icy streets, carrying him away from the systemic nightmare of the foster care system and toward an entirely unknown future. For 12 years, Leo's entire existence had been defined by survival. He had learned to anticipate the heavy footsteps of an angry foster father, to hoard small pieces of stale bread in his pockets, and to endure freezing temperatures by completely shutting down his own nervous system. He didn't know how to exist in a world where the air was warm, where the seats were soft, and where the adults did not look at him like a liability. Evelyn Vance sat across from him, her posture relaxed but still radiating that immense, terrifying sovereign power. She watched the boy closely, her sharp eyes cataloging the rigid tension in his shoulders and the defensive way he guarded the space around him. She knew exactly what he was going through. She had seen that exact same hypervigilant posture in Arthur 1,000 times during the early years of their marriage. "You don't have to be on guard anymore, Leo," Evelyn said softly, her voice breaking the heavy silence of the cabin. Leo slowly turned his head. His charcoal black eyes met hers. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice rough and quiet, still carrying the instinctual caution of a child who expected every promise to be a trap. "We are going to my estate," Evelyn replied smoothly. "It is a very large house. You will have your own room. A room with heat, a locking door, and a bed that is actually meant for sleeping. You will have hot food, clean clothes, and an education at the finest private academy in this city." Leo frowned slightly, his brow furrowing. His brilliant, traumatized mind immediately began searching for the catch, for the hidden cost of this sudden luxury. "Why? Why did you do all of this for me? You don't know me. I'm just a foster kid. The state says I'm unmanageable." Evelyn leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees. "The state is a machine, Leo. A machine built by bureaucrats who do not understand the difference between a broken child and a resilient one," Evelyn explained, her voice carrying the heavy, profound wisdom of a billionaire who had conquered the world. "I did not do this out of pity. Pity is an insult. I did this because when I looked into your eyes in that freezing parking lot, I recognized something that the world desperately needs." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the silver watch in his hands. "Arthur Vance, the man who built my empire, was told he was unmanageable too. They told him he was violent, antisocial, and destined for prison. But Arthur wasn't violent. He was simply refusing to let the world crush him. He used that incredible, fierce resilience to build Vance International. He built a fortress so strong that no one could ever hurt him again." Evelyn sat back, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. "I'm a 65-year-old widow, Leo. I have more money than I could spend in 100 lifetimes, but I have no heirs. I have spent the last 10 years searching for someone who possesses the exact same unbreakable iron in their soul that Arthur had. I wasn't looking for a perfect, obedient child. I was looking for a survivor. I was looking for a wolf." Leo looked down at his scarred knuckles. He traced the pale lines with his thumb, the physical map of his pain and endurance. For the first time, he didn't feel ashamed of those scars. He felt the crushing, suffocating weight of his past begin to lift off his small shoulders. He wasn't broken. He wasn't defective. He was forged in the fire, and he had survived. "I will teach you everything, Leo," Evelyn promised, the absolute certainty in her voice echoing in the warm cabin. "I will teach you how to read financial markets, how to negotiate with ruthless corporate sharks, and how to command a boardroom without raising your voice. I will give you the tools, the wealth, and the education to ensure that you will never be powerless again. And when you are ready, the empire will be yours. Leo looked back up at the incredibly powerful woman sitting across from him. The icy defensive armor that had protected his soul for 12 years finally, completely shattered. A single, silent tear slipped down his cheek, catching the ambient amber light of the car. It was not a tear of weakness. It was the release of a child who finally realized he was safe. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. He simply nodded, his dark eyes burning with a brilliant, newly awakened fire. The Bentley glided smoothly up a sweeping, private driveway, the massive wrought iron gates of the Vance estate opening automatically to welcome them. As the car pulled up to the magnificent, brilliantly lit mansion, Leo looked out the window. He was no longer a discarded piece of trash in the American foster care system. He was the heir to an empire. And the world was absolutely not ready for the wolf he was about to become. We live in a society that is quick to label the victims of its own broken systems. When a child is abused, neglected, and tossed aside by the very institutions designed to protect them, their desperate attempts to survive are often misdiagnosed as rebellion or defectiveness. The broken label is a convenient lie, a bureaucratic tool used to justify abandoning those who need help the most. But true strength is not defined by obedience to a cruel system. True strength is the quiet, terrifying resilience of a child who refuses to let the darkness extinguish their fire. It takes an extraordinary amount of power to survive the unendurable without losing your soul. When we stop looking at traumatized children as liabilities and start recognizing them as survivors forged in fire, we might just realize that the people we labeled as broken are actually the strongest among us. Thank you for listening to tonight's story. See you in the next video.